The myth of individualized pitching. Whenever you hear a front office member talk about how they make pitchers better, or listen to a pitching coach talking about how they develop pitchers on the minor league side, you'll often get a blanketed statement saying that we look at each individual pitcher, try to improve that guy on what he needs to be improved on. No two pitchers are the same. But in reality, when you look at the data, there are fingerprints that differ between organizations, which tells us to some extent that individualization of pitchers maybe is a myth. And in this data we're going to look at in this video, which is not public information, Class A all the way up to AAA, I'm going to combine those four levels together, group it by organization, and boil the data down such that we're looking from like a 40,000 foot view. We're going up in a plane and looking down at these orgs and what they do that distinguishes one from another. We may come to a conclusion on perhaps what is the top 10 or so of organizations from a pitching development standpoint. So I'm kind of nestling a minor league recap from a player development angle specifically into this video. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to be down here in the bottom right corner of your screen. At the top of your screen is going to be what I'm looking at on my computer, which is the specific sorts that I look through that I think are pretty important. Bottom left, we'll have some video. We'll start with an obvious question. Who throws the hardest in the minor leagues? The answer, unsurprisingly, is the Los Angeles Dodgers at 94 miles per hour. We're looking at four-seam fastball velocity on an org level specifically right here. They are at the top. The thing I want to point out is the gap between them and 2 and 3 here, almost a full mile per hour, right around 0.7, 0.8 miles per hour. That gap is equal to the gap basically between number 3 and number 25 or 26 on an org level. So that is what I want to point out. The Dodgers are throwing the hardest, but they're not only throwing the hardest, they're throwing the hardest by a lot. They've thrown the hardest in the minor leagues on fastball specifically for each of the last 3 or 4 years. They've made massive strides since about 2017, 2018. They are the preeminent team at pushing velocity, understanding the throw, making pitchers throw harder. And that leads to success, unequivocally. I understand that they're the team that gets ragged on the most for having injuries in their organization, etc. I would argue that it's a partial byproduct of risk tolerance. The pitchers they're willing to take on perhaps come with pre-existing injury, but it's hard to push away from the fact that velo equals success, and the Dodgers embrace that. And if it comes with more injuries, perhaps they're just trying to catch upside because they know they can probably pay to fill innings for whatever starters they need to make those starters better. But enough of the Dodgers. I always talk about the Dodgers because I enjoy their organization. The Royals at number 3, very interesting. This team right now, I believe, is top 5 or 6 in FIP in the major leagues, and I should have caught this earlier, but they're a team that I think is on the up and up, because if you look at their four-seam fastball trend over the last couple of years in the majors specifically, it's gone down pretty hard. And although we give a lot of the credit to the Red Sox and other orgs, the Royals are doing a pretty good job of that, and it also jumps out that they're doing a good job on the velocity side. The Cardinals, surprisingly, at number 2. I'm surprised because I think this org is going to go through a lot of turnover this offseason, potentially Mozeliak out, a variety of other people in and out. I think they need some change in that org, especially on the hitting side. But the pitching side perhaps has already seen some gains. I'm impressed with the fastball velocity there, and as we'll see in a sec, they also don't really have high walk rate, which I think is important. Now, the bottom teams in terms of four-seam fastball velocity are interesting, because I think we consider all these teams, I would say, good at player development for the most part. The Yankees have a very specific set of pitchers they like, taking guys who are heavy supinators, cross-body throw, big sweep, big movement, seam shift, etc., but they don't have a lot of four-seam fastball velocity. Perhaps that's a byproduct of the fact that they're maybe not throwing a crazy amount of four-seam fastballs. I'm going to have to look into that one more. I know they've taken a slight step back this year from a result standpoint as well. Jumps out to me. The Mariners just don't throw any four-seam fastballs, so I don't really know what to make of this one. I just don't think they really care. 25% is the lowest in all of minor league baseball. The average is right around, I think, 39 to 41%. So they're way below that by a decent margin, so I'm going to throw that away. And then the Guardians, the team that probably is number 2 in terms of developing velocity specifically in their pitchers, use the most amount of four-seam fastballs. I love this dichotomy between these two organizations, the Mariners and the Guardians. Mariners don't throw four-seam, have the same fastball velocity as the Guardians, who throw a lot of four-seam and have the same fastball velocity as the Mariners. It's two completely different approaches to player development on the pitching side specifically, and it manifests in four-seam fastball velocity, which is probably, if you could give me one stat in the minor leagues, maybe 2, give me 2. Give me usage and give me velocity. On four-seam fastballs, I would take that to the bank, and I think I'd be able to tell you a lot about what teams are better at prioritizing information and understanding things on the biomech side. If you're down this far with the biomech stuff, I think to some extent, you probably have figured out everything prior. There's no organization that is not embracing very simple things like seam shifted wake, etc., and not probably far down the path of biomech optimization in caring about what the biomechanists say and even having a biomechanist on staff. Okay, that's fastball velocity. Now, your obvious counter here is I don't really care about velocity. Everyone gets hurt when they throw hard. That would make you more interested in walk rate. So why don't we look at walk rate? Who does not walk a lot of batters? The Tampa Bay Rays at number 1, 9.2%. The Twins, another org I think is pretty sharp on the development side. And the Cardinals again. So again, the Cardinals here are not a team I went into this expecting to pop, but they do. They throw hard and they don't walk people. I think that's a really good formula for success overall. They don't strike out a ton of guys, but I mean, they're right around average. I won't body bag them for that. The Rays, though, I think have the highest K- walk rate in all the minor leagues. 25 minus 9% is really good. They're doing a great job. I don't think this is a particular surprise. They may still not be one of the best teams from a biomech standpoint, as say the Guardians or the Dodgers are, but they get results. And I think that's irrefutable. They're one of the top organizations at making pitchers better. Walk rates that are high. So this is where you get to the point. I think there's maybe some correlation between forcing fastball velocity and walk rate. The intuition is that there is, right? But from an R-squared standpoint, a correlation standpoint, there's basically no relationship between these 30 data points and walk rate alongside fastball velocity. But there are some instances where it jumps out. And I think the Dodgers being at the highest walk rate in the minor leagues makes some sense, despite the fact that they throw really hard. I think the analogy or metaphor you could use here is essentially that you have to hit the ball. This is using golf analogy. I don't even play golf. I suck at golf. But hit the ball really hard before you put it on the fairway if you want to be good. I don't think a lot of people are training in the inverse. And I would argue that's probably the example that would work with the Dodgers, is that you need to throw hard before we can figure out how to locate it. Now, is that the correct way to approach things? I'm not entirely sure. Dodgers had a lot of pitchers returning from Tommy John in the minor leagues this year. They didn't have the same Tulsa team last year that was absolutely dominant, that had a bunch of guys who were stretched, pitched a ton of innings, and were successful. Who knows, right? I'm not entirely sure here. It's a data point I'm watching for. The Astros and the Cubs are 2 and 3 here. Also 2 teams that I would put in probably the top half. They walk a lot of guys. Maybe this is just a byproduct of optimizing stuff. A lot of the time, when you optimize stuff, you're looking at big movement. I think inherently bigger movement is harder to control. So what you end up with is high walk rates. Or maybe you're just pushing stuff on everyone and then picking out the guys that are able to command the ball with big stuff. And then those guys become really good. You catch some upside, you get some ace relievers, ace starters, and then you kind of let the rest of your team, on the minor league side at least, not work. This is what I call like the VC approach, the venture capital approach to player development. You're not actually trying to make every player a major leaguer. That is the goal. If you want that as like a top line goal, sure. But the reality is like you want some very good major leaguers, I think, who then become cost controlled and you don't have to pay for perhaps some of that big upside that a lot of other orgs that don't develop well perhaps do. So that's how I would look at things. I would say the Cubs and the Astros probably take more of a VC approach. Could be wrong, just my intuition and looking at some of the data. But that is walk rate, hopefully appeasing some of the people who do not care about forcing fastball velocity or think that the Dodgers just blow up every arm because they throw hard. Maybe they do, but it's successful, so I don't really know what to tell you on that. Strikeout rate pretty quickly, let's take a look. Orioles, Rays again, which I just mentioned earlier, also walking no one. And the Rangers up here is interesting. Now the Rangers, I'm going to put in a category of what I call results teams, where I talked about this idea of individualization. There's a couple teams that have success, but I can't find a ton that is really individualized with them. And it's funny to me that these are the 2 of the 3 teams, I'll tease it, in that category, the Orioles and the Rangers. Really high K rate, strike out a lot of guys, but they don't really do anything specific that jumps out to me. I think the 2 things, if I had to draw, would be the Orioles preferring high release point, specifically on forcing fastballs. Maybe this is a bigger body thing. It might just be a byproduct of looking at specific shapes they want, but that jumps out to me. And the Rangers do have a good amount of sweep from a slider standpoint. So really small nuggets, not as definitive perhaps as like the Guardians and the Rays and the Dodgers as we talked about, but they get good results. It's irrefutable. On the bottom here, I think you run into 2 teams that are probably in the bottom 3 or 4 of all of minor league baseball in terms of pitching development. And that manifests in strikeout rate, below 23% for the Athletics and the Nationals. Not great. And I will leave the Mariners out of that because they're the sweep team. They're the low release, as I'll get to in a bit here. Super low release, very little four seam, bunch of sink. Maybe that just manifests in the fact that they don't strike out a lot of guys because of their pitch selection. I would like to see that higher. I don't think the Mariners are bad at pitching development. It'd be crazy to say that given the individuals they have at the major leagues right now on their staff. I would love to see them play with their center field wall, which seems to be having some influence on hitter success. And I'm fascinated to see if like Kirby, Miller, and some of these other guys fall off slightly and aren't as elite. But Yeah, it's something to think about, right? Mariners and the Yankees are probably the two teams that maybe don't have great results, but I'm not calling them bad organizations because I've heard, for the most part, that they are brought up in conversations as being good. So there are more interesting data points here, I think, just to point out. The Athletics and the Nationals, unfortunately, I do think are in the bottom pack. Would I like to see that change? Of course, the Nationals have some pretty fun arms, I think. The Athletics picked up my guy, Mike McFerrin from Wake Forest University. Really good dude. I think he's onto some good things there. It just probably takes some time to make change. And maybe those two orgs are on that route. But for now, we're not seeing it in the strikeout rate or the ERA specifically for the Athletics overall, which may be influenced a bit by their park, but I'm not going to get into that. Expected fastball damage. This is a fun one because you see, again, a weird mix of things going on. Expected fastball damage is probably my way to isolate off teams that play in weird park environments, which I think has massive influence on the minor league side specifically. So expected fastball damage, the highest, which means the worst, you have the Angels up here who throw, I won't bring it up, but they throw a ton of fastballs in the zone. And prior to this season, I remember some nuggets along this point of wanting to win first pitch, strike, etc. And I believe they pushed this down through the minor leagues. And I believe at the major league side, they did this for like 2 weeks and then stopped doing it, which makes, I think for the most part, you realize it's a terrible plan. I don't know what they're doing. I think this is probably a bottom org. It might be a hot take to say they're worse than the Colorado Rockies, but there's a lot of things that I'm not going to point out in this video that just don't look great. And expected fastball damage is terrible for them. And again, that backs up the fact we see with Oakland here being an org that I unfortunately think is just maybe slightly behind, but perhaps on the come up. And the Mariners, again, who are odd, right? They give up a lot of expected fastball damage. I'm going to say, qualified again, this is four-seam fastball damage specifically. The Mariners don't throw a lot of four-seams, so perhaps this is something where the four-seams they're throwing aren't great, etc. But I do want to give them some credit here. But I'm not going to give credit to the Angels, unfortunately. And if you disagree with me and say, no, the Angels are great, look at the bottom three teams here in terms of expected fastball damage. Almost 40 points lower than the Angels and some of these other worst teams. And three orgs, again, that I believe are probably in the tip-top of developing pitchers on the minor league side. The Rays, which we've continually talked about, have done pretty much everything amazing here. The Brewers, who are maybe in this category of results over pure differentiation. I know they like weird looks, but that's something that is often not entirely caught on the aggregated minor league level. And the Orioles, who are #1 in strikeout rate alongside lowest expected fastball damage. I think that's a really sharp combination to have as an organization, so kudos to them. That's what I got on expected fastball damage. Now we can jump, just some quick nuggets here. Teams that I want to point out just because I thought they were interesting. Twins throwing a lot of cutters. Now, classification can be a weird thing on the minor league level. What I saw in the cutter data was that these shapes are in fact cutters. The Twins throw a lot of them by a decent margin. They had about, I think, 13% on the minor league level. I believe the average was more around like 6 to 8%. I often think of cutters as like finishing pitches that guys add late in their development. The Twins clearly see this as something that guys should optimize earlier for whatever reason. Now, I think the Twins are one of the sharper orgs. They were one of the first orgs on Kinetrax, which is markerless motion capture. I think they got a lot of smart people there in terms of how they're integrating data and putting that onto the field. I know Eno Saris from The Athletic has mentioned a lot that they do a really good job from like backing into shapes based off how the guy moves, which is perhaps some innovative thought that not a lot of other teams are maybe approaching it that way. So maybe this cutter thing has something to do with it. We've seen it on the major league side for them a couple times with guys like Louis Varland. Braves, Phillies, Mets. The NL East loves splitters here. 1, 2, 3 in splitter usage. The Braves, good results. Always a bit weird because I never get like positive feedback in talking to other people on different teams about the Braves. But they do a good job. Like they get results and they use a lot of splits, which I think is good. You saw this manifest in like Kirsten Waldrop and Schwellenbach this year. That pitch was added late for him, but perhaps they just have more acceptance of the pitch, which even if they don't grade out as say a top 5 team on the development side in the minors, I think at least the willingness to embrace splitters when a lot of other teams who are more old school perhaps would push away from them, assuming they cause injuries, is probably a good sign to some extent. Mariners, I mentioned, highest slider usage, biggest sweep, lowest four seam, highest sink. They like low slot guys. They want you to sink the ball and sweep the ball. It's pretty simple. Highest four seam usage for the Guardians, we already talked about. And the last thing I'll talk about is Dodgers and Rays. They're the only teams throwing sliders on average 84 plus. So that is, I think, again, a telltale thing as to what they like as an organization. Although these two teams like sweep in bullpens, I think for the most part, they maybe shy away from that from a starting pitcher standpoint. And you see it slightly manifest here, how important hard sliders are. There's this idea that the threshold of 85 plus, like there's no bad 85 plus mile per hour slider. The Dodgers and Rays are getting there. I wonder if in the next 2 or 3 years, when I do a video like this again, possibly, they are averaging 85 miles per hour and are the only two teams doing so. But pushing Fastball Velo specifically is interesting. The fact that the Rays aren't high on the fastball velo side, or I think they're more average, say they're above average. They're not 1, 2, 3 as we saw, is interesting. Maybe they're pushing slider velo, but not pushing fastball velo. I don't know. Maybe that's just a byproduct. I'm overthinking it slightly, but the Dodgers pushing all velo is, again, not particularly surprising. Now we go to what I'm going to call almost like a matrix here. Now I'm missing some teams. I thought about this a lot, but call it like the Big Nine, which is going to be, is a dumb name. I totally understand. But the velo four-seam teams, right? This is what I'm talking about in terms of individualization. When every team is saying they individualize, and then you see things that are good results, high four-seam velo, high slider velo from these teams. The Guardians, most fascinating team, throwing a ton of four-seam fastball. You know, they're individualizing, but they're individualizing with their fingerprint, which is just, I think, getting lost in a lot of analysis. And we now have the data to be able to back it up. The Guardians, for example, use the most four-seam and have the lowest four-seam velo. That is differentiated. If they were to individualize pitchers the way the Dodgers were, they would be pushing velocity, which they do. They're just taking guys who are at a lower rung of velocity and moving them up. They like big extension lefties. There's a lot of nuance there to what they do as an org that is individualized, but it's not individualized in the way that other orgs are saying it is, because the Guardians have a fingerprint that is more distinct, I'd say, than almost any other organization. And that lines up, I would say, between the Rays and the Dodgers, who are also really individualized, throwing sliders really hard, preferring four-seam fastball, throwing four-seam fastball, pushing velo, etc. That is what I'm talking about. The myth of individualization is that every team is saying they individualize, but every individual team is doing it in their own unique way. So individualized pitchers are good, but maybe it's acquisition, maybe it's draft, maybe it's the communication between those departments. It's distinct. So there's this idea that you can individualize, but at the end of the day, when we zoom out on this 40,000 foot view, different orgs do things specifically. And they may not say it publicly, but it's backed up in the data that these orgs are distinct. Death to the four-seam. Perhaps my favorite category, because it's one of the more modern categories that I think is really aggressive and takes some, I'd say it takes on a bit more risk as an org than maybe just purely pushing velo. Mariners, Red Sox, Twins. I think these teams are all above average in pitching development. They hate four-seam fastballs. These are the bottom three teams in four-seam fastball usage. We talked about the Twins a little. The Red Sox, this trickled up to the major leagues and minor leagues. The thing I will point out about the Red Sox that's fascinating, though, last year, I believe they were middle of the pack in four-seam fastball usage. You may think, and I've even said on other videos, that it takes some time for things like this to get implemented, right? If you turn over staff, bring new people in, you know, the excuse is often given, it's going to take some time for changes to come. I generally think that might be BS. I think in the Red Sox this year proved that, where they were average pack in terms of four-seam fastball usage last year. They're now completely in the bottom. In the matter of one offseason, with some regime change, Andrew Bailey coming in, Breslow coming in, they made changes that are manifesting in the data and now have them, I think, squarely as the top half org in pitching development. So whenever you hear it's going to take some time for results to show, maybe then the results that you're aiming for are not accepting a high enough level of risk to actually then see results quickly. The Red Sox are doing that. Mariners, again, just hate four-seam. We already talked about that. Now, these are the teams that perhaps have some defense in terms of being individualized, where I don't necessarily see a ton of differentiation among teams, but they've gotten results for each of the last 2 years. Maybe it's a byproduct of personnel. This is what I think the Dodger excuse would be overall, which is that a lot of their guys got called up and rushed because of major league injuries. So they didn't really have a lot of guys logging. You didn't have River Ryan and Nick Frasso and these other guys logging a ton of innings at Tulsa. They had to go to other arms. Orioles, Mets, Rangers, all teams with really strong results. I don't see a ton of differentiation there. So maybe they are actually individualizing well. I would argue that this is perhaps a bit finicky. These teams all probably have pretty good pitchers in the minor leagues. I know the Mets are kind of up and up. Brandon Sprout, etc. Rangers just graduated, Kumar Rocker, Jack Leiter. I think these are the teams to watch. I wouldn't probably put any one of those teams. Maybe I would put the Orioles above, maybe like the Mariners or the Red Sox. I think the Orioles might be up there because they've done this for a couple of years. But these are the teams that I want to make sure they keep getting the results year over year, even without that differentiation, because that will then make me more confident that they actually are doing something well from an individualization standpoint. These are the only three teams that I will accept that they individualize pitchers, because it's harder for me to find specific tendencies. But this is probably a mix. These teams are probably all in the top half. And I would say we get 5 probably of the top 5. Now, I'm planning on doing something this offseason where I actually reach out to individuals within organizations. I'm going to try to do like one in each org so I don't get double counting in one particular org in their perception, and ask them to rank, say, the top 5 and bottom 5 organizations from pitching development, from a pitching development standpoint. I'm not sure how exactly I'm going to categorize that, what I'm going to say it's based on, because I do think acquisition plays a part. But I think it's pretty important to do that. I want to get some idea of whether I'm on it with these teams. I think I am from talking to people, but I'd love to get more objective info and something that we can look at and get a 30-person, 40-person sample. Talk to 40 people in baseball. This is what they thought. So stay tuned for that. It'll probably drop on my Substack, which I'll link to in my video description here. But for now, I think we caught most of the good teams at pitching development here with these 9 or 10 teams overall. So that's what I got. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Ton of info in here, I know. A little longer than usual for me as well, but I think it was a lot of good stuff. So I'm going to put a bunch of chapters in here, which is irrelevant to you, because if you made it to the end of the video now, then you probably watched all the way, which I appreciate a ton. You know, follow me, subscribe. Any comments, I'm always in the comments, or my DMs are open on Instagram and Twitter and elsewhere. So, you know, hit me up if you got any questions or are interested in anything on my perspective. If you disagree, or if you're with an organization and you somehow made it to this late in the video, if you disagree or think I said anything wrong or want me to point out someone else, let me know. I'll keep it anonymized, you know, open call. But again, if you made it to a major league organization, if you're in a major league org and you're watching to the end of this video, I'm going to tell your GM, because they're probably mad at you for watching this thing and not doing actual work. I'm somewhat joking here. But anyways, yeah, appreciate the video. Appreciate you watching the video. I appreciate myself making the video, I guess, as well. This is falling down pretty quickly, so I'm going to leave. Thanks for watching as always.